Isam, thank you so much for joining us on Expanding Horizons. So, to start off with, I wanted to get to know a little bit more about your background. You're a historian, a writer. So, why did you choose to get into that? And why, in particular, are you focused on South Asia? So, could you share a little bit on that?
Sure. So I have lived in Delhi for the last 22 years. So my family moved there back in 2004, that kind of time. So I spent a lot of my kind of primary school in Delhi. And yeah, that's always been home. I was actually planning to go into physics, and I did an internship at high school at like the CERN Large Hadron Collider, because like one of those student internships, because I thought that was what I wanted to go into, particle physics and or astronomy or something like that. And it was only when I was 18 and I went back. So my high school was a boarding school in the UK. And it was when I was 18 and I went back to Delhi and I started traveling around India for a bit on a year off, that I just became completely enchanted with basically kind of Indian history. And specifically, I think the everyday heritage that is kind of, lying in these amazing towns that never, even growing up in Delhi and being educated on history and using the Delhi curriculum. You never hear about the Buddhist caves of Junagadh and the amazing tombs there, or you never hear about, the incredible heritage of Murshidabad in Bengal. These are whole cities that are kind of, on a global scale, exceptional, but somehow have fallen off the map. So I got increasingly obsessed with that, began writing small historical pieces. But I think the real thing that changed me was when I was at university. I was studying Sanskrit and Farsi, and some friends and I were chatting. We were in London. So, my Indian friend Sparsh and our Pakistani friends Amina and Sadia were basically chatting how absurd it was that we could all here sit in a room together in the UK, and yet within the subcontinent itself, it was impossible for South Asians from across the, like in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh to all sit in one room. It's virtually impossible. And we got working on this partition project where we'd use virtual reality to reconnect families across the India-Pakistan border. So imagine you've got an old Haveli or temple or Gurdwara that's sitting in Lahore that your grandparents had left behind 75 years ago. We would send out a camera team, create a virtual scan of it so that your nani can wander through her old childhood Haveli or school or mandir, and likewise allow Pakistanis to go visit their old heritage in Delhi or Meerut or Hyderabad or Lucknow or wherever it might be. And so we were doing that for 4 years, and that, I guess, is the real origin of this project. I was firstly amazed by how many... Partition is the kind of thing that creeps behind so many different conversations in India, I think, particularly in North India, but also in the south. I mean, Hyderabad had 3 times more refugees left Hyderabad in 1947, moving to Karachi, than left Palestine during the Nakba. I mean, it's extraordinary numbers, and these stories are sort of somehow completely left by the wayside in favor of these much more jingoistic national stories of kind of... The story of independence is always told, but the story of the traumas of partition and the lost friends and the human contacts on the other side are often neglected.
It's a very fascinating point, and I think we can get more onto that neglected point because I think it's not covered, a lot in the curriculum and in generally discussed a lot. So, first of all, congratulations on this release. I think it's your first debut
Yeah,
book,
here it
right?
is. Shattered
Shattered
Lands.
Plans. So, congratulations on that. So, can you give us a brief overview and the thesis on this new book of yours?
Of course. So the book really comes from a conversation that I was having when I was interviewing a partition survivor from Tripura, who'd migrated from what's now Bangladesh to Tripura in the 40s. And I asked them about partition, and they said, which partition? Do you mean the separation of Burma in 1937, which divided Nagas between two countries, and Mizos and Rohingya? Or are you talking about 47, which is what I was talking about? Or are you talking about 71 and the division of Pakistan into Pakistan and Bangladesh? And for me, that was a kind of, what? That, I barely registered that Burma had been part of the Raj, let alone that, most Burmese had considered themselves Indians in the 1920s. And so the story of the book is the fact that 100 years ago, the Raj, British India, was a far larger place than we tend to remember today, and included places like South Yemen and Dubai and Doha, and Nepal, Bhutan and Burma, in addition to just India and Pakistan. And that over the course of just 50 years, 5 partitions carve this single British colony, the largest colony ever created, that contained a quarter of the world's population, and the largest Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, and Zoroastrian populations on the planet into 12 separate nation states, into Yemen, Oman, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Burma, Myanmar. So 12 separate nation states that emerged from what was once India in the 1920s, and from this area where, there's a bizarre, fact that, you had Yemeni women Yemeni Jewish women trying to migrate to Palestine after the Balfour Declaration that this was going to be a Jewish state. They had to go on Indian passports by virtue of living in Yemen. This is a story that's completely forgotten to us living in Delhi today. This was I was like, what? Yemen was part of the Raj? It's yeah. And so, and it looks at the fact of divided memory and the links that once tied these places very closely together in much stronger ways. This was not, I think, most people, even when they learn that places like Aden were part of the Raj, they assume it's just for kind of administrative purposes, but it goes far deeper than that. The book opens with Gandhi traveling across the Raj in the same year, the same 2 years that he does his famous Salt March. He begins his time a year earlier, before the Salt March. He is traveling across Burma, speaking to the Indian National Congress cadres there. And by a year afterwards, he's traveling across modern-day Yemen, chatting to the Indian National Congress cadres there. And everyone across this region considers themselves Indian nationalists, despite being Arabs and Burmese. And today, of course, it's completely incomprehensible to imagine a world in which an Arab can consider themselves Indian, or a Burmese person could consider themselves Indian. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's very fascinating because I myself didn't know so much about it. And, Burma, Yemen being part of Raj, I myself didn't know, and it was news to me as well. So, why do you think this got neglected and forgotten? And why is all the focus like on 1947, like a few partitions and the others just forgotten? Is just less bloodshed, or like were there other
Yeah.
interests? Like, why do you
So,
think it got
so
neglected?
two reasons, I would say. For one, with each of these partitions, archives themselves were partitioned, and so it's only by visiting all of these separate archives that you build up the entire story. If you, if you want the whole story of the history of Qatar, you need to go to Bombay's archives, because that's where they're kept. They're not kept in Qatar. If you want the story of, a lot of modern Bangladesh's history, you'll have to go to Rangoon in modern day Burma. And so it's to do with the archives themselves being partitioned. I think also what you said beforehand, I think that the Great Partition of 1947, which is in my 5 partitions, the third partition, had such a monumental effect that it kind of overshadowed all of the others. This is the central event of 20th century South Asia, and it's the prism through which a quarter of the world sees their past, present, and future. You can't understand the kind of psyches of modern India or Pakistan or Bangladesh without understanding partition, and you can't understand, the war that we had with Pakistan just a month ago without understanding this event. You can't understand, the place of Muslims in modern India. You can't understand the NRC that's being rolled out, as part of the CAA and NRC. Those are all rooted in partition, and the arrival of Bengali refugees in the Northeast is the first time that debates around creating an NRC, a National Register of Citizens, first gets started. And you can't understand the neglect of India's heritage and the fact that you get these amazing, beautiful estates and mosques dotted around Punjab and Haryana abandoned if you don't understand partition. It's such a seminal central event. And I think even in Delhi, it's there, but it's, partition is increasingly spoken about, the 47 one, but it's sort of overshadowed the others. And I think it's interesting, if you go to Bangladesh, for example, it's the reverse. So their 1971 and Bangladesh's independence from Pakistan, the final of the 5 partitions, is spoken about absolutely everywhere, and you've got museums to it, etc. And yet 47 will never be spoken about. 47 has somewhat been overshadowed by the more important for Bangladeshis 71.
Yeah, yeah. Even growing up, you heard a lot about 1947 back in Delhi and India, but the others, it's not mentioned. And you mentioned like it shaped a lot of things, including like the present day world. So, uh, how do you think these have shaped the current political and social landscape of the country? Do you see its impact today as well? And if so, like how, and what ways?
I think massively. I think you can't understand, for example, the rise of Hindu nationalism without understanding partition. And, so much of the rise of the modern BJP, a lot of the chat about creating a Hindu Rashtra, for example, is based around the conversation of, well, if the Muslims got a nation, why can't the Hindus have a nation too? Also, 71 specifically was a major influence on Modi, for example. Modi joins the RSS and later the BJP as a result of seeing Hindu refugees fleeing what's now Bangladesh in 71. And that event explicitly transforms him into the man who is now Prime Minister of India. You can't understand Pakistan without understanding this country that was born out of, civil war, essentially, the worst communal violence in history. And it's as a result of feeling threatened by India from its birth that, its military spending dominates its economy to the expense of basically everything else, and to the expense of human rights in large extent, because of the furies born out of partition. This was a state that was born in the worst refugee crisis in history, that was born without any of the major cities of the Raj. It was born, other than maybe Lahore and Karachi, India was born with all of the other great cities. Kolkata, which was meant to be Pakistan's capital, out of interest. When Jinnah imagined Pakistan, Kolkata was the capital of Bengal, which was the largest Muslim majority state. And so he was convinced that Kolkata was going to be the capital of the Raj. It doesn't happen that way. And of course now Bangladesh is even independent of Pakistan, so it's impossible to imagine a world in which Kolkata was... He was convinced that Pakistan would get both Kolkata and Delhi as the two great Muslim capitals, kind of thing.
Wow.
And so I think that, and then, you look at the way that Bangladesh continues to be shaped by the politics of 1971, and the two major political dynasties. Hasina is the daughter of Mujibur Rahman, who is one of the great founding fathers of Bangladesh, and Khalida Zia is daughter of Major Zia Rahman, who's the other great freedom fighter from 1971 for Bangladeshi independence. And so Bangladeshi politics continues to pivot on the personalities of this fifth partition. And we see, for example, the first partition, Burma's separation from India, is rooted in, in its wake, you get a bunch of politicians who are incredibly anti-Indian, who want to kick out the Indians who migrated to Burma during the Raj, take over the country, specifically this guy U Saw. And he's the first person, when he's trying to organize the expulsion of the Indian population, he includes in his list of Indian ethnicities the Rohingya. And the present-day genocide of the Rohingya that we saw in Myanmar in the 2010s, and the kind of persecution that continues to this day, is rooted in the events of 1937 and the separation of Burma. And even things like the Gulf War in the 90s that we saw in Kuwait and Iraq. Saddam Hussein's whole premise for invading Kuwait was based off of the fact that this was supposedly a long-lost province of Iraq that had only survived thanks to the protection of the Indian Army, the fact that the viceroy had extended a protectorate over Kuwait. So Kuwait was a protectorate, a princely state, essentially, of the Raj, a bit like Jaipur or Hyderabad, but slightly more independent than that. And Saddam Hussein's argument was that Kuwait had only survived into the 21st century as a result of the viceroy's protection, and now that the British protection had been pulled away, it was time to reclaim what was rightfully his, which there's all sorts of problems with that argument, but it's fascinating that that was his argument for basically kickstarting the Gulf War. So many of the great conflicts we see today, from the insurgencies in Kashmir and Balochistan, in northeast India, Naga separatism, the persecution of minorities in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, the rise of the military in Pakistan, the Rohingya genocide, the Gulf War, all of these have their roots in 5 partitions that carved up the Raj.
That is very interesting. What do you think were the primary motivations behind these? Do you think they were just economic interests, colonial strategy, ethnic nationalism? What were the core motivations that led to these partitions?
I think you've exactly hit on them. I think each one was different, and I think that you've hit exactly the nail on the head with each one of those.
Okay.
In the case of Burma being separated, it was a mix between. So Burma was much more underpopulated and was becoming, the New York of its day, with huge numbers of immigrants arriving from the rest of the Raj to the point that Rangoon was a majority Indian city, despite, and Burmese were increasingly pushed out of work. And so it was an argument increasingly like Brexit. Should we remain part of this economic union, or should we separate from this economic union and control our immigration more? That was the root of Burma's separation. There's also, I think, with both the separation of Burma and the Arabian states, there is a strong sense that Indian nationalism was increasingly pivoting around the creation of a nation that resembled the holy land of Bharat. So Gandhi, etc., very explicitly doesn't want Arabia and Burma to remain part of the Raj, because he wants his independent nation to be Bharat. He wants it to resemble the geography of the Mahabharata, right, which is 2,500 years old or even longer. And, this nation that he imagined stretching from kind of Sindh to Isam and Kashmir to Kanyakumari, which didn't include Burma and didn't include Doha and Dubai. So that also plays into it. There's a huge amount of, British divide and rule. The Brits, I don't think, create any of these tensions, but they very much play into them when it suits their hands. And again, I think it's difficult to talk about what the British did, because each British viceroy is so different. So, for example, Viceroy Linlithgow is undoubtedly pro-Muslim League, whereas Mountbatten is undoubtedly pro-Congress. And Wavell, who's the viceroy between the two of them, is kind of even-handed and rather fair. And frankly, you can see him being this kind of impartial arbitrator. But so I think it's wrong to imagine that there was any grand master plan behind British policy. But individual viceroys very much play into these divisions when it suits them, if that makes sense. And then in the case of Bangladeshi independence from Pakistan, that is rooted incredibly in increasing Pakistani racism towards Bengalis. And crucially, I think more than anything, it was the onset of military rule in Pakistan. So the Pakistani military was overwhelmingly Punjabi and had something like 5% Bengalis in it. And so when the military takes over, the more populous province of East Pakistan is essentially cut out of the government. Suddenly you don't have any Bengalis in the country's government because there are no Bengalis in the military, and the military now is the government. And I think that is far more the origin of everything that we saw in Bangladesh's independence. It's to do with the military not having had a Bengali representation in it. And these led to tensions that would eventually lead to, an independence movement, a Pakistani crackdown on said independence movement, brutal violence, and kind of, genocidal levels of violence, and ultimately Bangladeshi independence as we know it today.
That's very interesting. Do you think these partitions, the paths that history took, do you think this was inevitable? It was going to lead to this, or do you think history could have taken a different route where these partitions did not take place?
The moment that I choose to begin the book is 1928, and I feel like in the 20s, none of them were inevitable. They were, you could not foresee the creation of Burma as a separate country any more than you could conceive of the word Pakistan had yet to be spoken. There was no conception that a country called Bangladesh would exist. Maybe some of the princely states you could have imagined as becoming separate, because they were, but like Nepal, an independent Nepal was just as foreseeable as an independent Hyderabad state, which would have been like, an independent Telangana. That like the borders that we have today were no more inevitable than anything else. But I think, for example, that by the mid-90s, Burmese independence is looking inevitable. I think that the creation of Pakistan was still avoidable as late as August 1946, 1 year before Pakistani independence. You've got what's known as the Cabinet Mission Plan, which Jinnah accepts, and that it's actually Nehru and Gandhi who reject. And that plan had basically argued that just like Britain today is made out of several constituent nations, you've got Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So we could create a kind of, an India that had West Pakistan, East Pakistan, North India, South India, and Deccan as 5 separate nations that constituted one larger nation state. Just like, the United Kingdom has not become less unified by Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England having separate national identities within the framework of Great Britain. So that was one plan for independence that Jinnah accepted. Jinnah said, this is enough, this is all I want. And Nehru and Gandhi pull away from this because I think it's that the northwest frontier around Peshawar had a Congress government, and they wanted it to be part of the North Indian province of Greater India, rather than as part of the Pakistan province of Greater India. And Jinnah basically just pulls away. He says, if you can't agree to this, then there's no point arguing with you at all, and I can't trust you at all. And that the falling apart of the cabinet mission plan, I think, is one of the great tragedies that we don't talk about enough. The fact that there was so nearly a compromise, if that makes sense. And it's accepted by Nehru and Gandhi until they pull out. And I think likewise, right until the mid-1960s, I'd say, the dream of a united Pakistan that includes West Pakistan and East Pakistan, modern-day Bangladesh, was still a feasible dream. And, there were, throughout the 90s, you have out of 8 Pakistani prime ministers, 4 of them are Bengali, 4 of them are from modern-day Bangladesh. By the 1960s, once the military takes over, that dream of a united Pakistan looks ever less viable because, far less money is being put into East Pakistan than the West. Money is being, East Pakistanis are being taxed, but all the money is being spent in Islamabad and Karachi. And so I think each of these partitions were avoidable. And you could have also imagined a world in which, several princely states had clubbed together and created a third dominion that was neither associated with India or Pakistan. That was a foreseeable thing that I think many politicians and many princes assumed would happen. And so the borders of South Asia, I'd say, were neither foreseen nor inevitable as late as the 90s. But of course, today are so firmly etched into our mind that it's hard to imagine anything else.
Yeah. Do you think this vision or dream of earlier having like a East Pakistan, West Pakistan, North India, South India, do you think it's possible for reunification, or do you think they're just not possible in the future? Or do you see like more divisions taking place in the future, given how history has unfolded in the past?
I think that, we've seen the fall of the Berlin Wall, and no one saw that coming. We've seen countries reunify. I think that Pakistani and Bangladeshi national identities are just as real as modern day Indian national identity, and that it can't be done through kind of brute force or anything. It would come through economic and political cooperation. And so long as the conflict over Kashmir continues to fester, etc., that's never going to happen. But you can imagine like SARC as becoming more important if it's ever resolved. And I think we've come far closer to resolving Kashmir than most people tend to realize as well. Most people don't realize that as late as 1960, Pakistan proposed a military alliance with India. That throughout the 90s, Pakistan and India shared military intelligence, and ISI and RAW's predecessors were working closely alongside one another as each other's greatest allies, essentially. And that under Vajpayee, the first BJP prime minister, and both Nawaz Sharif and Musharraf, Pakistani prime ministers, a deal over Kashmir was pretty much worked out, basically treating it along the similar lines of the solution created in Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, which today has turned Ireland from one of the most violent places of the 20th century into one of the most peaceful and economically prosperous. A deal along those lines was attempted by Vajpayee and Musharraf and Nawaz Sharif, and was again pulled away at the last second. But I think if we're ever going to have a deal in Kashmir that allows everyone to flourish, it's going to probably be along Vajpayee's lines, I think. The deal was something along the lines of Kashmir would become borderless for Kashmiris, so Kashmiris would be able to travel along both sides of Kashmir, and it would be much like Irish people can now travel along both sides of Ireland, but the line of control would effectively be an international border for Indians and Pakistanis who weren't from Kashmir, and that there would be different rules for Kashmiris and Indians and Pakistanis, but that they would remain under Indian and Pakistani sovereignty, and that these regions would be gradually demilitarized along UN auspices. And it became so close to succeeding, and pretty much everyone in the room agreed. And I think it was finally basically thrown under the bus by rogue actors within the Pakistan army, who I believe basically kind of, started firing over the line of control. Everyone pulled away from the table, and this very near resolution which would have led to the signing of a peace accord between India and Pakistan, and very possibly huge economic benefits for both countries. The greatest potential economic partners for both India and Pakistan are each other. Huge economic potential that is kept apart because of continued cross-border funding of terrorism and continued, human rights clampdowns, etc., and particularly the ongoing sort of conflict over Kashmir, basically. But I think that we've come so much closer to resolving it than everyone thinks, and we have a solution that was agreed to by all parties, that was, so almost achieved, sitting on the table. And so that would be what I would say. Like, I think that some form of economic union, a bit like the European Union, if Kashmir was ever resolved, would probably be quite likely because it makes so much sense economically.
I want to ask a little bit about your research into the book. You did conduct interviews, I believe, for this book, and you did research into it. So, is there anything that has stayed with you from your research? Any particular interview that was compelling enough? And was there anything that you chose not to include in the book?
So there's all sorts that I chose not to include, but not because of any particular reasons other than, there's all sorts of interviews that I did, but the stories didn't quite fit into the narrative. Or some stories were too similar or talking about the same thing. It's quite difficult. So I'm trained as an oral historian, that's my background, and you have all sorts of incredible interviews with people about their lives. And I'm donating a lot of the interviews to like the Partition archive in Berkeley and that kind of thing. We've got an ongoing exhibition that's currently in San Francisco and Delhi and Amritsar with Project Astan, which is my old job. But you can't include everything, and this book would be kind of 3 times the size if I had tried to. So you do have to be careful what you include and what you don't. But yes, there are several interviews that have really stayed with me. There were a couple of times, I think one of the things that stayed with me most was when I went to go through the archives of Firuz Khan Noon, who's the last democratically elected Pakistani prime minister before the military took over for the first time. And this family is living in Lahore with all of these papers that very few scholars have gone through. And it was incredible just being able to hold in my hand the document that ends Pakistani democracy, where it says, "My dear Firuz Khan Noon, I'm so sorry that I've had to, remove the constitution, ban parliamentary discussion, and that your country is now under, military rule." And it's just sitting in their house. It's extraordinary. I think also there's a man called Sultan Ghalib al-Qayati, who's this extraordinary figure, the great-nephew of the Nizam of Hyderabad, the last sultan of Qayati state, what's now eastern Yemen, and he's now living in exile in Saudi Arabia. And chatting to him was one of the most extraordinary experiences. He's this incredibly eloquent, well-read man who's basically living as a stateless person in Saudi, but, eating with the cutlery of Sadiq al-Umra of Hyderabad, but in this kind of, but he doesn't have a passport anymore, etc. So he's a rather extraordinary man. And then all sorts of just, I think particularly interviewing my friends' family, because growing up in Delhi, everyone that has a partition story, and you don't necessarily know it until you start working in partition. But everyone I know who started working in partition has the same strange experience of suddenly realizing that absolutely every single one of their friends comes from a partition family. And I think, for example, interviewing my friend Sparsha's grandfather, Ishar Das Arora, who came from what's now Pakistan, moved to Delhi, worked in the kind of, for the Jal board. And we actually managed to get Sparsh and me traveled to Pakistan together, and we managed to track down his ancestral home, found the Muslim family who'd saved his grandfather's life during the riots. So when all the Muslim marauders were coming to kill the Hindus of the village, this man, Sher Khan, kept Ishar and his family in their barn and were saying, we will defend you and no one will come through me. And then basically when the mob arrives, he says, no, there's no Hindus living here. And then they managed to smuggle Ishar and his family across the border into India. So going back and meeting that family was utterly extraordinary, and I think one of the most touching days of my life, really. All these villagers coming and kind of garlanding Sparsh and saying our brothers returned from across the border. And yeah.
I think those must have been very emotional as well. And emotionally packed. Is there anything that you're nervous about how people will receive, or how has the reception been to the book so far?
I think so far so good. It's just hit #1 in India, so that's pretty extraordinary. And I think so far everyone's rather loved it. I've not had particularly bad responses. There was a lovely review in the Guardian recently and in the Tribune. So far so good.
Amazing.
I was definitely nervous because I think a lot of these things are very touchy. Kashmir is very difficult to talk about, and Balochistan is very difficult to talk about, and Bangladesh is very difficult to talk about. But I think so far, because it's not, I deliberately tried to remove my voice and try to speak through people that I've interviewed and put other people's voices forward. And I think that everyone has appreciated that.
Do you think any of these partitions out of all of the five that you mentioned which one of these is perhaps the most misunderstood or wrongly remembered and neglected?
I think the separation of Arabia. I think the fact that Yemen, the fact that Dubai and Doha could have been part of an independent India or more likely Pakistan is a story that's been entirely forgotten. Whereas there are other hundreds of books on the others, there are only about 4 books on the separation of the Gulf from the Indian Empire. If you go to Mayo College, you find plaques to the Sultans of Oman amongst the princely states. If you look on the list of princely states in India, alphabetically, the first one is Abu Dhabi. And if you and yet these were the states out of all the states in the Raj, all the princely states, Jaipur, Jodhpur, Kashmir, Tripura, Manipur, etc. The states that were lowest on the rank, the highest ranking state was Hyderabad. Then you had states like Kalat and Baroda. Then one lower you had Jaipur, Jodhpur, etc. At the bottom with 0 gun salutes is Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Qatar, Bahrain, etc. And the Brits essentially offer this region to the government of India. And there's a bizarre telegram that I found, which basically says, we were surprised by the apparent unanimity of opinion amongst Indian officials that the Persian Gulf was of little interest to the government of India. So the Indian officials actually turned down the whole region because they just see them as small desert villages on the other side of the sea, and what would we want with that? And of course, bearing in mind that oil had yet to be discovered, we're talking about the late 1930s. And yeah, I would say it's the greatest missed opportunity for India and Pakistan, because you can imagine, had none of these borders been created, you can imagine a world in which the entire joint wealth of the Persian Gulf, all of those states, not just Qatar and not just Bahrain, not just Dubai, but all of them together were part of India or Pakistan.
Well, that is quite surprising. And I think this was pre-oil, maybe after oil would have been completely different. I want to ask you a little bit about what we've lost culturally, spiritually, economically because of these partitions. What have we lost as in amongst all these different dimensions through these partitions?
Whole worlds. The kind of ease of living alongside one another, multiculturalism. You've lost, you know, Punjab. If you look at things from the 1920s, Punjab was considered one of the most kind of religiously, culturally diverse places in the subcontinent, which was, majority Muslim, but with large Sikh and Hindu minorities everywhere, and where these worlds were so culturally intermingled that it was often impossible to separate. It was, in the 20s, a Bengali Hindu would have had more in common culturally and culinarily, etc., to a Bengali Muslim than they would to a Punjabi Hindu, And today that isn't the case. Today that these worlds have been ruptured. Today, if you go across modern day Punjab in India, every village you'll see abandoned mosques that are often, 1,000 years old and talk of an incredible heritage that's just been abandoned overnight. And likewise, if you travel across Pakistan, you see hugely historic temples just left to abandon. And they're very visual reminders of what's been lost. I think that Burma in the 1920s was one of the most economically privileged, brilliant centers of the world. There's a telegram that talks about Rangoon was until recently second only to New York as a city of import and export, but now it is number 1 in the world. That's in the 1930s, and Burma has completely vanished from the map, and it's become so sort of it's become so riven with civil war and ethnic rivalry and ethnic hatred that this place that was once the multicultural center of Asia has now forgotten any, even its indigenous populations can barely get on today. And, we've got a civil war that continues right until now. You've got, I think bizarrely, if you want to see the multicultural atmosphere of South Asia in the 20s. The place that you have to go to today is Dubai. And you can see Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and Nepalis and people from Bhutan and people from the Gulf and people from Myanmar. And it really is representative of what a lot of these cities were once like. And yet, I think a lot of the syncretism still exists, and there are still places across the subcontinent, despite rising nationalism and religious tensions. Across India, you still have a vast Muslim population that still, for the most part, lives alongside Hindu and Sikh brothers and sisters. Likewise, if you go to Sindh, unlike Punjab in Pakistan, Sindh is still something like 20% Hindu. And you can still see people living alongside each other just like they always have. There's huge pressures politically and huge horrors that people have to go to live their normal lives, but they still do, and I think that we shouldn't overlook that and see. But yeah, I think we've lost a huge amount. Shared histories, I think you just need to realize that at partition it wasn't just people and land that was being divided, it was whole histories. And famously in 1947 both governments were fighting over the Mohenjo-Daro necklace, which was the greatest find from Harappa, which was this beautiful golden string with jade and agate and lapis lazuli threaded on a golden string 4,500 years ago, at a time when the subcontinent was trading with Mesopotamia and the pharaohs of Egypt, and unsure of who should get the necklace. And after fighting over it, the bureaucrats decided to snip the necklace in half, giving half the beads to India and half the beads to Pakistan. And so even history was divided.
I have a few rapid fire questions for you.
Let's go.
Yeah, just think of the first answer that comes to you. Who's your favorite historical figure that you'd want to meet?
That is a good one. I feel like Jahangir. I like this Mughal emperor who has the craziest, just like obsessive collection of animals, and he just has like dodos and zebras and like I don't know. I just feel like, and he's patronizing art, and I feel like whereas a lot of these other emperors are kind of, I feel like he would have been fun to hang out with.
Nice. If you could go back in time, where and when would you go?
If I could go back in time, I'd probably want to check out some of those like ancient libraries, like Library of Alexandria and Nalanda, and those kind of places, and go travel around the ancient world a bit. Or actually, no, Alexander the Great. I'd go join Alexander the Great's campaigns and go see what the world was like in 300 BC and
Okay.
across, because they would have seen a sweep of the world that would have just been extraordinary.
Yeah, covered a lot. Um, you've studied Persian and Sanskrit, right? So is there any Persian or Sanskrit phrase that has stuck with you?
Oof, that's difficult. I think the specific stories that have stuck with me more than phrases. I think, from Persian, I remember just being absolutely besmotted with like Layla Majnun. And I think that Layla Majnun was one of the most extraordinary reads I've ever read in my life. And I think that the Mahabharata for Sanskrit literature or the Meghdutta by Kalidas were the two things that really kind of touched me. I grew up on Amrachitra Katha comic books, and so the Mahabharata will always have I have these 3 massive volumes of the collected Amrachitra Katha Mahabharata stories in my bedroom, and so that definitely has shaped me a huge amount. But the Meghdutta, I think, is the most beautiful piece of classical poetry that I've seen. I think is the opening line. So that could be my phrase.
Yeah. Any travel destination that you have been to that made you see history perhaps differently?
Yep, I can immediately tell you that going to Bamiyan for the first time. So I went aged 17 to Afghanistan, and it changed my life forever because it was so similar to India and yet so different. And I returned to Delhi and saw it in an entirely new way, where suddenly I was obsessed with seeing all the similarities with what I'd just seen in Afghanistan. And it was Bamiyan's an extraordinary place. You've got this incredible Buddhist heritage in the middle of Afghanistan, surrounded by all these beautiful mosques, etc. But these extraordinary kind of like Ajanta style Buddhist carvings, and tragically blown up by the Taliban before I went. But even the niches are amazing, and you can still go into a lot of the monastic cells where with Buddhist iconography that's still there.
Nice. This is a difficult one, but perhaps you can tell me what comes to your mind first. Do you have any favorite book that you can think
That
of
is
or that has really had an impact on you?
okay. Give me a second. I mean, it depends. What are we talking? Favorite novel or favorite history book? I think if you can give me that, I'll.
Anything, whatever comes to
Okay,
mind when I just ask this question.
sure. I think recently, in terms of novels, I've become obsessed with. I mean, my favorite novel of all time is War and Peace. I think it's fantastic by Tolstoy.
Mm,
I think George Orwell's books, I think, are amazing. His novels, like 1984, etc. But Burmese Days, the fact that he was born in India and spent his teens being a policeman in Burma before basically becoming one of the first Brits to really speak out against what was going on in the Raj and speak out against imperialism. I mean, not one of the first, but one of the first to put it down so eloquently in words. So I think that he's extraordinary. And I think for Indian history, I think Richard Eaton's India in the Persianate Age is just continues to blow my mind. And I go back to it every now and again and just learn new things.
So you grew up in Delhi, right? So how was it like growing up in Delhi with a family of artists and historians, and what was it like?
I loved it.
Okay.
I mean, Delhi's very much home. And, growing up with a family of historians and artists, it meant a lot of charging around the Rajasthani countryside, going around old forts and going to see kind of Amer Fort or Jodhpur Fort or, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Lots of random kind of heading off around Bengal to go meet Baul musicians or to Kerala to meet some Theyyam dancers, etc. But it was, it's a fantastic country, the best there is. And Delhi is one of the great cities for all of its very evident faults. I feel like it's one of those cities that everyone has a tortured relationship with, but everyone who's actually spent time there can't help but love it very, very, very deeply. And it's your kind of quintessential toxic relationship. You can't pull yourself away, and it's
Yeah.
killing you, but you're kind of completely smitten.
Yeah. Yeah, getting choked by it. But do you have a favorite food from Delhi that you would love to eat?
Hilal's Hotels Nihari. So it's just
Okay.
near the food street with like Kareem's, etc., near Jama Masjid. But you go right down this gully, like I think it's the first major gully, and there's this Nihari joint called Hilal's Hotel. Just they every day they open the pot at like a.m. for breakfast, and there's only one time that I've actually made it for breakfast, but it remains the greatest meal that I've ever had in my life. But I think
Wow.
we'd stayed up for a party later. There was a shadi, and it ended at 3 a.m. And we were like, "Wait, Hilal's is opening in an hour. We should go." And so headed out to the Jama Masjid, and the best meal I've ever had in my life.
Nice.
Yeah. So Hilal's Nihari. I also think I'm a big fan of the gulati kebabs from Al Kosar.
Mm,
Al Kosar hits the spot. And then, to be honest, in terms of scenery, the Carnatic Cafe dosas that are now in the Sundar Nursery, that like
yeah.
beautiful park, and there's now a Carnatic Cafe there, so you can have really damn good dosas that are like, not the best in the city, but kind of up there in the most beautiful, picturesque place possible. So I think that in terms of restaurants, that's probably my favorite in terms of like
Nice.
location.
Yeah, I have to check those out. Do you have any views on artificial intelligence and how it's perhaps going to impact history or writing?
So I
Anything
think
that you
I
can
think
think
it's
of?
made I think it's made there'd be a lot more kind of just random disinformation out there. People posting on Twitter about who are just researching through AI, and a bunch of crap comes out. Frankly, at the same time, it's an incredible tool, and so already I use it to help me summarize stuff, create it for beginning research on something new. It's very helpful at kind of creating a reading list for you or something like that. It shouldn't be relied on. I get frustrated, which you see on Twitter, where people are like fact checking using Grok. Grok, is this true? And as if Grok knows better than the expert who's posted it. But and like I think that there is huge potential. I think that the world that I don't want us to get to is where it's impossible to tell kind of AI created video or photographs from real video and photographs, because then it becomes much harder to tell what's a real historical source and what's not. And I think that there's a danger that we get into of losing the ability to tell false from fact from fiction. But I think that it's an incredible tool that people shouldn't shy away from, but we need to be aware of the pros and the cons, essentially.
Final question, like what are you looking forward to in the future? Is there any story that you have in mind, any narrative, any history? Like what's next for you? What is the next
I
for
can
you?
answer that very simply: finding a lost city. me and my friend Anirudh Karnaseti have become very obsessed with there is a lost medieval capital of India that is sitting somewhere in Karnataka, and we have been working with archaeologist Disha Aluwalia to try and figure out where it might be. And we think we might have a chance. So we've been applying for some grants recently to try and actually, it's going to cost not that much. I think it'll, to find the location, it'll cost like probably around $50,000 or something like that. But like the potential of finding the Deccan's lost capital, if that makes sense. Like, it would be like the discovery of Pompeii or something. And we think we know where it is. So fingers crossed that we get some of these grants.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Sam, for being on the show and answering all these questions. This was like super fun.
Thank you so much, Neil. This was great. I loved it.